Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today's guest is Kirsty Dunlop. She is an academic, a poet, and also the editor-in-chief of Spamzine, sorry. So welcome to the Subjective Space, Kirsty.
Hi, Sindhu. Thank you so much for having me.
You're absolutely welcome. And we have so many exciting things to talk about today. So first, let me start by asking you about the internet, right? And
Yes.
in the post-internet landscape, which is like the Web 2.0, or whatever it is we call it now. So is the internet dying is my first question, because it's extended beyond, is it extended beyond comprehension? And also with AI in the mix now, when you Google something, AI says what it thinks it is, which is usually nonsense. And so data is so skewed. So my question to you is, what is the, you can't tell what's real and not real anymore on the internet. So what are your thoughts about the internet?
Yeah, that's a great question to begin with, because it's such a big question in a way, right? So I'll just share my thoughts, which are obviously not the only correct ones, subjective, of course. But yeah, I'm really interested in where the internet is now, and that term post-internet, which began with an art movement kind of in the early 2000s, and certainly it was something Spam wanted to take up as a poetry magazine in 2016, where it was quite unusual actually to write about the internet. That seems it's almost cliche now in some ways to write about the internet, as it's everywhere. It's part of our lives, whether we're super online or not. But the term post-internet means life lived with the internet, not life lived after the internet. But I do think people are trying to find other definitions now, because post-internet can be seen as kind of a more old-fashioned term. As I said, it was quite unusual at that time, certainly, even in 2016, which wasn't super long ago, to have poems that could also be memes or to use found language from the internet. But it's such a fascinating concept, is the internet dying? And I guess part of me really, really hates part of the internet and the algorithmic structures that we've become stuck in. And I definitely think those are almost beginning to kill off what the internet is. And also I totally agree that when that AI function began to appear in Google, I mean, I wasn't totally surprised, but I felt quite angry actually.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on AI and creativity, so we can maybe go into that further. But yeah, for just now, I think it's super interesting to think where we are in time. Are we still in this post-internet? What might the post-internet look like? Which a friend of mine, Ian McCartney, sometimes talks about. It's like that interesting thing of postmodernism. What comes after that? Now, what comes after post-internet? I'm wary of saying that all the internet is dying, because I actually think there are so many beautiful spaces still found on the internet as well. And that's something I've become really interested in through my work in interactive fiction and writing into code. And there's some beautiful things people are making from the interactive fiction community, which is this gorgeous community where people help each other out to use code in creative ways, to publish work for free. And I think a lot of people think that works like hypertext or interactive fiction are kind of quite nostalgic and maybe stuck in the 90s when we're first starting to play around. I would also be wary of that kind of thinking around it, because I guess that follows a kind of optimization trend, right? Like things just need to get sleeker and sleeker and sleeker, which is what the internet wants us to feel, right? That we don't know what's going on. And that's part of the scary part about AI. A lot of people actually don't know, what is AI? I mean, there's whole other conversation about that, and that's not really like artificial intelligence yet, even, right? It's just
it's quite dumb actually.
Yeah, that's a really good market name for it, because it makes it sound more impressive and exciting in future. But yeah, I think we should be careful of optimization narratives, and there are still these beautiful carved out spaces on the internet, whether it's community, whether it's activism, but also in terms of creative spaces and what people are doing with code. There's lots of alternative models for that don't need to fall into something like AI, which I think is a very trendy word for a lot of works around that right now. Very time to answer, but yeah, it's a difficult question.
No, but I think what you said now, it sort of leads into the next question I had for you anyway, right? Because you talk about wandering on the internet, right? Because this whole thing about optimizing the internet, like this sort of instant gratification of like, I think, I used to work as a communications consultant for many years in Mumbai. So I worked with like corporate startups and all of those, businesses who wanted to, the thing was omni-channel experience, right? Everything had to be for their e-commerce or their business, whatever it was, they had to sort of streamline this experience on the internet. So people do not have the chance to wander away. Like they have to sort of, they're forced to exist within this whatever world they're trying to create, right? So when you're talking about wandering on the internet, which is like slow meandering versus instant gratification. So could you tell
Yeah,
me a little bit more about that, how that interests you? And is it about breaking out of these sort of channels when you're trying to do these things?
totally. I just love the word wandering, because I think it can elicit so many different affects, like physical wandering, daydreaming, which I love as an act, and I think is something that's also pushed out of us quite young. Like I was often taught off for like daydreaming at school. And I have issues with that, kids not being allowed to daydream. But also, yeah, what the internet does to our daydreaming, and that's part of
Yeah.
this too, right? Like how we think is so affected by the media we're surrounded with. Again, whether you're super online or not. I work in a public library as well, and so many things have to be done online, and we get people that are completely computer illiterate and they can't get
Mm-hmm.
their basic needs. So we can see it kind of in the everyday, whether people want to wander on the internet or play with technology. You're totally right. There isn't room for that in lots and lots of different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, super interesting wandering. Um, from this idea of getting lost. One of my favorite books is A Field Guide to Getting Lost by Rebecca Solnit, where she talks about
Mm-hmm.
active wandering. Um, and it's something that's, yeah, I guess come into my work a lot. A lot of my work tends to push process right up to the surface because it's just something I'm intrinsically interested in. And for me, wandering is also connected to ideas of failure or ideas of kind of disruption, because I guess part of what you were mentioning about only being allowed to go down one channel, and same with sort of algorithmic rhythms that a
Mm-hmm.
lot of us find ourselves in. It might sort of look like a sort of sense of wandering, but it's also being, dictated through things that we can't see or are not aware of. And the beauty of wandering, I suppose, is having an insight into where your own mind goes. And that's part of a creative process too. And I
Mm-hmm.
do say the capitalism of the internet and the commercialization of the internet is trying to sort of take that away, and that also keeps us within our own bubbles, right, within our own thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
and that creates divisions and all sorts of other things emerge from that. But yeah, I'm
Which is funny because the internet is meant for you to like, exchange and sort of engage with things that are not in your bubble.
absolutely, and I think that's actually why something like Wikipedia can be a great place for people to wander in, because it
Mm,
can link different things. It's community built. So there's definitely so many spaces that we can wander in the
mm,
internet. And I suppose one reason I'm interested in this as well is through my writing, which engages with gameplay and what it is to wander in a
mm,
game.
mm.
And so, yeah, that might come up a little bit more, but
Yeah.
this idea of winning or losing and what wandering might mean within that is something I'm really interested in. So wandering as connecting to play, like our
Mm,
childlike curiosity, which is always brimming beneath the surface, that
yeah.
wants to find more. And the internet can actually be great for that, right? Because you can find out loads of facts and interesting things. So you can still wander through the internet, but I definitely think the way it's beginning to dictate how we think and where we can wander is
Mm.
fascinating. Yeah.
That thing that it interests me too about the error and about the failure that you mentioned. We'll talk about that when we talk about your work and gameplay. First, let's start with string theory, right? Because
Mm,
I know you're fascinated by string theory and it inspires your work. So I was wondering why that theory particularly interested you. So I'm an engineer, so I'm very curious to know how you came to that.
yeah.
So, do you think of the internet as a string? I mean, I know it's a funny question to ask, but that has been stretched beyond its limits. And also, what is asphyxiated stringing? What does that mean? And what is
Mm.
it? How does it apply to your work?
Yeah, so to give some context as well, I sent Sindhu an essay from a larger essay collection that's a digital born collection. So if I could describe it in a sentence, it's essentially like a series of essays that you can play and that infect each other. And one of the essays is called Three Strings, and it's probably the closest essay to a poem in the
Mm-hmm.
piece. So there's three separate strings that you play. Um, and actually, I say this because I came to string theory actually not not string theory actually wasn't at the forefront of my mind at first as I was writing this. So it began to emerge, and this idea of emergence is really something I'm really interested in too. Like, how do we come through ideas in writing and putting that process at the surface? Strings I became really interested in because the words started following me everywhere. You know, when you start seeing patterns like the apophonia that can emerge. So I play a stringed instrument. I play the Scottish harp, the clarsach. So I've always been very interested in, and the clarsach is a history of being a storytelling tool and something that people learn by imitation rather than reading music in the folk tradition. So I really wanted to write something about musicality and pacing and rhythm because I'm not a very visual person. I tend to think in rhythms or in pulses, which has been something interesting as well. We're trying to design a game because it's meant to be games traditionally or conventionally, I guess people think of them as quite visual, whereas mine's very much text-based, kind of rhythmic-based. So I was interested in strings and this idea of vibrations. And then as I increasingly learned to code, the word strings comes up because it's a very common coding structure whereby you put words into a string and a string or a line of numbers in code and they're played or not. And then all these other strings started appearing, and I was really interested in, and then I became really interested in string theory, which is, I'm probably not the best person to give a definition of, but I can give my best shot. So when these ideas of particles as single dots can be understood as having strings and entanglements, and the idea that string theory could be a kind of theory of everything. And I'm a little wary of the theory of everything in one sense, right? But there's also something very elusive and kind of exciting about that. And I love this notion of vibrations and something that may be simmering beneath the surface, but that is not quite visible yet. And for me, that happens in all writing, right? There's all this work that we don't see that sort of simmers beneath, or there's allusions to other words or other works that might come up. But in a digital piece, you have the code simmering below, and you have this knowledge that one word could result in a variable or another direction that you might not yet be aware of. So I was interested in that. But to your question of whether the internet is connected by strings, yeah, there's something kind of fascinating about that concept, isn't there? In a sense, I think you mentioned this fixated stringing, which was a phrase I used in my piece, and that sense of everything being strung together and not being able to get out of a structure, I guess, is part of that sort of sense of breathlessness or being stuck. And that's certainly something I've noticed within like my own sense of attention or my own sense of creativity. Getting stuck within structures of thinking and wondering how much that is to do with my own brain and how much that is to do with outside structures. So I was interested in both the exuberance of this idea of string theory and also the sort of entrapment. Strings as these vibrational things that connect, but also, yeah, this idea of being strung out, you know, really was really interesting to me too. Yeah,
that's a beautiful way of putting it. I also liked. I played. I don't know. Played. I read it. I engaged with your essay. So I liked a bar that was in it. A string is that which unravels you as you are unraveling it. The creased code characters controlled yet uncontrolled. So that's pretty much what it is. What you explained just now, right? Like I feel like you get stuck in this code, but then you sort of feel like you are playing it, but it's playing you. I don't know.
yeah, exactly. So there like are sections in a game where it might feel quite open, where actually, you know, the writer is kind of controlling you. And there might be other sections of a game, depending on how open a game is or how closed, where you actually can have more of an influence of the writing. So yeah, the openness and that feeling of being lost versus trapped is super interesting to me, that tension. Yeah.
I think now is probably a good time to talk more about your main focus in your work, right? Emergent gameplay, emergent essaying. So I will explain what I think it is, and then you can tell me what it actually is. So, so your work essentially looks at game design with like hybrid creative writing approaches, right? So you take sort of video game mechanics, poetics, and do pedagogy with it, and you sort of look at it's a sort of like new media writing, or you're like hybrid creative thinking and writing. So it's all of those things. So
Yeah.
can you tell me about your work and how you came to this first of all? And were you like a video game aficionado? What led you to this?
Yeah, I love that description because you've got all the layerings that I'm interested in right there. So yeah, I'll answer the last part of your question first, how I came to it, and then talk a little bit more about, yeah, where this idea of emergent SEing coexists and is in relation to emergent gameplay. So I absolutely was not a video game aficionado, and I absolutely did not know a thing about code, which is why I actually like teaching code to creatives a lot in the context of making creative work, because I think it's something that isn't quite approachable, or it's only for certain people, or you have to have a certain kind of brain. Um, I mean, I loved The Sims. Sims was probably the only video game I really played. There's so much
Yeah.
to say about The Sims. That's a whole other podcast. But no, I didn't really have access to like video games as a kid. Although I definitely tried making them without really knowing they were video games. Like I remember as a kid making a PowerPoint and having two options and then giving it to my friend, and she was like, "But it leads you to the same option because obviously it's a
Yeah.
PowerPoint presentation." So I was definitely interested in kind of thinking interactively, and the reason I got into this, I guess you could say, is quite niche field, was through, I was writing a piece actually, and it had all these different strands to it, and it was a story about a journey gone wrong, and it was kind of a comedy piece, and I actually wrote the piece shuffled, so it didn't have a beginning, middle, and end. And I've always been really interested in non-linear narratives, and what does the beginning, middle, and end mean even. That was kind of a lot of my thinking, and where I find myself going back constantly. Structure has always been something I think of even before content. When I write, or an idea for structure will come, and then the content will kind of emerge from there. So I had that at the forefront of my thinking, and then I workshopped this piece to a group of writers, and a bunch of them said, it'd be really interesting if it actually was shuffled. Like we didn't have it on a page. I spoke to a friend who did code, and they helped me put that into like a code that worked and showed me a little bit. And that felt way beyond my capabilities. So I thought, oh, that was fun. Okay, like that was an interesting experiment. And then I thought, well, I would kind of like to try some other projects. So I did a project where I wanted to think about physical space and digital space. So I hid bits of stories inside library books in a library. And if people found them, they didn't know I was the author. And they emailed me, and I made a game that was essentially about that. Which was, a really interesting project, because got all sorts of characters emailing me, some really suspicious about it. So I've always kind of, liked pieces that probe or could be seen as transmedia spaces. So I got into that. Then I thought, okay, I'm not sure I've got the coding ability to actually write something like this. And then I discovered this interactive tool called Twine, which people might be familiar with, which was launched, I think, about 2009. And it's completely free. It was launched by this guy, Chris Kilmes, and basically it's interactive, open access to anyone, and you can write non-linear stories on it. And you can actually start with very minimal code. As I've learned more, I've kind of added to it. So much of my writing is made in that tool, but it's introduced me to so many other things. I've taken quite a few coding courses now in like HTTP, HTML, and JavaScript and things like that. So I know a lot more about it now, but I think I realized that I found coding really difficult. Like it didn't come to me naturally, but I was interested in it. I was motivated to do it by the creative work. So I was really interested in that interplay and that motivation. So that's kind of how I came to it. Then I realized that actually I thought what I was writing was hypertext, which is when words are interlinked with other words. There's amazing practitioners from the 90s who made some incredible hypertext, like Shelley Jackson, amongst others. And definitely some of my work might be dubbed as more hypertext, but I was actually really interested in having elements of gameplay within that. So the idea of collecting objects or collecting emotions, tracking data within the context of the game and things like that. But also I was interested in like, what is gameplay? Because when someone says make a game, I think there are various thoughts around what that might entail. Like, do you win? Do you lose? Are there puzzles? Are there riddles? Like, where does gameplay begin and end? And emergent gameplay, it means essentially when, if we take it as its most open definition, it's an emergent term itself. So people have lots of changing ideas of what it is. The way I understood it and the openness I liked about it is that in simple terms, just when simple interactions in a game might lead to complex outcomes. So let's say you pick an object that might lead you to a whole other landscape or another portal. And I thought, like, what would that look like in a very language-based terrain? And so I'm thinking of essaying in its sort of original definition, which harks all the way back to Montaigne, before it sort of became a bit more of a regimented academic structure, as actually one of the most hybrid forms we have. Something that can encompass lots of different forms and could be messy. And I liked essaying because that obviously comes from the French to try, so trying as is a very active word, rather than something kind of regimented or underlined and formalized, stuck. And gameplay is an active term, it's a game design term. So I like this idea of what would a practice called emergent essaying look like. And in my work, it looks like a series of essays that you play, and there is conclusions and there is things you collect, but it's a little more ambivalent than just winning or losing. It's sort of teetering between those two binaries and playing with that in between space. I'm actually like the idea, forgive me for saying emergent too much, but I like the idea of emergent essaying.
Yeah.
I like the idea of other people being able to pick it up and think about what that looked like, whether that might work in a more visual practice. It's definitely something that's digital born, but thinking what could that be, and I think I've learned a lot through teaching and conversations where it could go. But where I'm at, the practice is the thing, and the thing is the practice.
Yeah, it is emergent.
Yeah, it's all emergence. But yeah, I think I'm interested in it as an active term, and I think digital writing feels very active. It can break at any moment. It's a very fragile thing in some ways. Yeah.
So there's like a continual motion of language and thought, right? Which is what interests me about this anyway, that it's always happening. It's never happened yet. It's always happening. But does that also lead to sort of this, the idea of ludonarrative dissonance? Tell me about that and how that plays into your emergent essaying, right? Because I've thought often about, as a writer, like what are the different, forms in which I can write. I've written like screenplays, I can write a novel, I can write this and that. But when somebody is manipulating or playing with what you've written, and they can manipulate it, in a different way that you didn't originally intend for it to go, which is interesting and exciting, but also problematic for me. I'm like, what if they do something I don't want them to do, So how does this sort of play into your work?
Yeah, so ludonarrative dissonance is this idea that there's a dissonance between what it's about as a game and what it's about as a narrative. So you have those ludic elements, which might be like picking up something, or choices being limited, or finding yourself in different spaces where you might be trapped. So it's that gameplay element that I'm sure all of us recognize, whether we play a lot of video games or not. You'll get it in everything from something like Animal Crossing to like Colossal Cave Adventure, the first interactive game in the 70s. So but sometimes people can use ludonarrative dissonance like to their advantage. Like it's not fully like a negative thing, but it is certainly thought that if you have an alignment between how it's working as a game and how it's working in terms of its contents, you tend to feel more immersed within it, right? So a really good example of this is this amazing interactive piece called Depression Quest, written by Zoe Quinn. And it's about the feelings of living with depression. And as you move through the game, options become limited based on your current state, and the music changes. So you actually get that feeling of what it is in an interactive sense with it. So I think that's a really good example of something that's not got ludonarrative dissonance. But I think it's something to keep in mind, because I think there's often, when we're making interactive work, things look cool, so you might add them in, and that's certainly something that maybe, at times I'd be like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have this? But then it's like, is that adding to the story? I guess, but the same thing when we write in any form, right? Like, how is the structure working with the content? What effect do you want people to have? Do we want people to meddle with it? In my case, there actually are portals through which you can travel, which allow you to meddle with the piece a bit more, but you have to work to get there. So I've put up certain boundaries that I can control, and not all interactive work is fully open. So I think at first I used to think, everything's so interactive, but now there's different stages of what you can allow that interaction to be as a writer. So I totally agree. Like, I wouldn't want my essaying to be completely open, because I do want to make some points. And yeah, right. And also, you're totally right. Like, giving complete freedom of read, goodness knows what can happen. That is basically just what the internet is, right?
Yeah. Then AI would be writing stuff, which is not true
at all. I don't want that. Actually, a lot of my work is thinking through, like, what does it mean to be a human online? And that human aspect is really, really important to me. And that's not to say that, we're all kind of cyborgs anyway. Like, we're always collaborating with digital.
What is that thing called again? The Neuralink. Oh, the neural
Yeah,
link.
yeah. Yeah, also, there's the more than human too. So it's not to say that the human is like the best, but I am really interested in keeping that human at the forefront. So the
Mm,
places where I do let the reader kind of navigate it are very specific questions. So I think there's one moment where I kind of ask for almost like an abstract response, like, what direction are you going in, and what does the direction feel like? And that
mm,
gets stored as a variable in the
mhm,
text, and then it, that word, whatever the word they have chosen, comes up, and that might mean that the sentence doesn't work at all. Like it might exist as a kind of glitch, but it
mhm.
also gives room for the reader to have that interaction and to have moments where they can play or intervene in the text. But I guess as a writer, it's about how you set those up and
Mm,
doing it with intentionality, right? Because I think what you're
mhm.
saying is it's like that thing of AI, and so then intentionality and human intention kind of goes away, which is definitely,
Mhm.
yeah, which is definitely a problem.
So good you mentioned glitch because that's what I was going to ask you about next, right? Which is fascinating to me as well because as an engineer, glitches were a big problem in my life.
Yeah.
So it was like I spent 4 years just like fixing glitches in my freaking code. So I'm like I
Yeah.
understand the glitch. So tell me about what glitching means to you in your work because there are how do you sort of define it in poetics? Like what does that mean?
Yeah.
And how do you constantly think about like having a glitch aesthetic in your work or something like and how it can and also about glitch feminism, right? Like how can you sort of break things and how can you sort of move the needle or question things from within it? So tell me how these things play into your work.
Yeah. Great. And also, yeah, glitches can also be really anxiety provoking things that are
Of
negative, right?
course.
So I have to hold these things.
Yeah.
Much of this project is about me being like, why doesn't it work?
Yeah.
Coding is really hard, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that should be emphasized. I suppose I'm thinking of the glitch in lots and lots of different varied definitions. So the one that we probably know at its most basic level is like when something malfunctions, a technical malfunction.
Mm.
And it derives from the Yiddish "glish," which means slippery place, which I think is really interesting. Like the actual
Mm.
sound of the word, I think is really interesting. Glitch, like it's got this sort of
Yeah.
click, sort of
Yeah.
satisfaction. And I loved that because the slippery space is kind of a hybrid space of writing or an in-between space. I thought that was really interesting. And then glitch, it's kind of is quite in the zeitgeist at the moment, I feel as well, which is interesting. Like you hear a lot of people use glitch. I'm seeing it in a lot of people's poems at the moment, so it's definitely there. But I love how it kind of transforms, but still carries its ambience throughout its different definitions. So
Mm-hmm.
glitching in video game communities means when you kind of try and break the video game in some way to find your own pathway through it. So that's like almost like cheating in a video game. It can be a form of glitching, but could actually be a very like creative response.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talked about the glitch aesthetic, so that's largely what's spoken about in a lot of academic spaces. And I think the glitch really rose in sort of, particularly in academia, through visual culture. So glitch pictures. Rosa Menkman's an amazing glitch artist that
Mm-hmm.
does a lot of work on that. And then now increasingly, glitch is being used in a theoretical context, which I think is really interesting. So you mentioned glitch feminism, which is a term coined by the amazing writer Legacy Russell, whose book entitled Glitch Feminism came out in 2020, but she's been working on this idea for a while. Would encourage anyone to visit her website. If you just type in glitch feminism, you'll see a lot of talks about it, so you'll find out about it more than me. But I was really fascinated when this book came out, which was right in the middle of me doing this research as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Legacy uses the idea of the glitch to think about how we break open binary structures, in particular to do with gender, but it also touches upon race in her
Mm-hmm.
research. But thinking like also who gets to make projects online. So she refers to a lot of digital artists, but her overarching theory is kind of like it is a manifesto, glitch feminism, a manifesto, and talks about what does it mean to glitch the binary body? What does it mean to glitch our ideas of identity, and it's very intersectional in its scope. And I loved this because I also think glitch carries with it. I mean, a glitch can be awful and frustrating, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it carries way more exuberance than the word failure. And there's been
Mm-hmm.
great work like the Halberstons, the Queer Art of Creative Failure, that have picked apart, the amazing parts of failure. But I think failure as a word is still locked in quite a lot of negative affect. And
Yeah,
it
for
can
sure.
either be something small or it can be something
Mhm.
like huge. But to me, it carries like quite a lot of potential within it, and I'm wondering whether that's why it's kind of being picked up by all these different fields. But yeah, this idea of like feminism, of breaking out of expectations, and of really thinking about who gets to exist online, who gets to speak about being online. Yeah, all those aspects really fascinated me, and I think glitches for me tied into ideas around failure, vulnerability, and this idea of glitching or moving expectation away, which can also
Mm-hmm.
exist in the kind of work we make online. Like, what does it mean
Mm-hmm.
to glitch our expectation of how we interact with it online and what topics we talk about too? Yeah.
That's very interesting to me, right? Because I'm a like a person of the internet. Like I was born with the internet, sort of like I grew up on the internet. So it's through these glitches that I sort of made the best discoveries. It's like where I
Right. Yeah.
found the interesting stuff. Like I would be looking for something, but I'd find something way unconnected with that. But that's the actual thing I wasn't looking for, but I found. But that's so interesting, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, so how glitch can, as you said, it's an anxiety, it is an anxious thing. Like as an engineer, I know glitches are a problematic thing, but glitches also lead you to find new solutions. Like you end up writing a whole different code, or like you end up sort of bypassing that part of the glitch. Like there are ways you can
Absolutely.
do that. So which is very interesting to me. So when you're writing poetry, do you I don't know, I don't know what I'm trying to ask. Is it like, are you consciously trying to glitch it?
That's such an interesting question. Um, yeah, and I like that as a framing. I've probably not ever, I think because I think of it so in tandem with my online work, which can encompass poems too, but yeah, definitely. And I think that's maybe what a lot of poetry is about, right? It's about taking us to a line that we weren't expecting. And I always feel that it's like, what did Eileen Myles say about poem ending? Like, it's like sex. You want it to like, you want to get out, but you want to get out in a different way each time, which I love.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the kind of glitching as
Yeah.
well, right? It's like you don't want to end where the reader thinks you're going to end, and similarly, that can happen at a line level as well, or beginning a poem that you think is about one thing and then takes you somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's a really exciting part of poetry, and that's the part that feels active. But I would also
Mm-hmm.
say that it does need to exist in poetry too. Like I write fiction and hybrid works too. And, for me, in all language, that's kind of the goal. You want to take the reader where they don't expect, like in a good tune where suddenly something changes, and you might have a whole other tune embedded or a remix where it takes you somewhere else. Like it's that sort of human excitement that
Mm-hmm.
I think we're as writers we're often trying to like get there and get ourselves excited while writing it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
and
now tell me about emergent essaying as performance, because I think that's another big part of your work, right? Because it's all about the praxis, and tell me how you teach. How do people perform this, or how does it happen?
yeah, the performance part is really interesting, and that's definitely something I've thought about more in the latter parts of the project. I
Mm-hmm.
think as I'm able to stand back a little bit from it, going, okay, yeah, how else might we think this, or what other sort of fields of interest might this come into? So I'm really interested in performance because there's a performance of reading. I've also performed musical stuff before, so in some ways, I think actually performance is where I feel most comfortable as a person, even
Mm-hmm.
though I think I'm quite shy in other contexts.
Yeah.
I was interested in performance in that vein. And then also, it literally is a performance when you have a digital piece because the code is kind of working as an actor, right? Like you're
Mm-hmm.
creating, let's say you have variables, which are when like one option. So you might have variables that store numbers or data, or you might have choices that you don't have full control over. You put it into the code, but the code chooses which one to reveal. That's such a performance, and there's so many parallels we could draw to like improvisation and things like that. It's like you might have a
Mm-hmm.
few key ideas, but you don't know which one's going to come up. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the first to talk about this at all. Like J.R. Carpenter, who's an amazing digital visual artist, talks about code as well in performance in really interesting ways. She says something like, it's not a coincidence that JavaScript is called JavaScript. She wrote an amazing book called An Ocean of Static,
Mm-hmm.
which shows all the code and thinking about that in sound. But I guess with the essaying aspect of my piece, I was interested in exactly what you said, kind of how does emergent essaying bring up to the surface what is happening in all writing and offer a kind of so I don't have to use the word performative, but I don't know if that's quite right, but a performance to show people in different disciplines what essaying can be. So a really interesting reaction I had was I showcased this work at an interactive fiction conference, but it was interesting because I was the only creative writer there.
Oh,
A lot of
really?
people are making visual art, and that might have some narratives, but it was very much about VR is was a really big thing at the conference. This was back in 2021. But a lot of people had real difficulties with how I was using the word essaying, and it was only after they played the essay that I made as part a digital born piece that I made as part of it that people understood it, and that really interested me. It's like sometimes as writers, I think like the work itself needs to be read sometimes rather than us explaining it. Like I love hearing writers
Yeah.
explain sometimes embedded in the work, if you see what I mean. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in how emergent essaying can act as a performance in that way. Like and yeah, as something active that we don't know quite where it's going to go, although it's not completely open because it's been designed by someone. So it's almost like a kind of world building where the writer creates the dimensions of the world, but here the world is like language and thought, and where thought goes. So I'm really interested in that, and I think it's actually through the teaching that some of these ideas have come up, because some people have created pieces, some of my students using Twine and other codes that we've worked with that are like really performative, that you can imagine actually being in more of an exhibition space, which is really interesting to me. As part of SPAM, we did a project called. Sorry, go on, Cindy.
No, you were saying something about span. You finish that, and then I'll ask you.
Yeah. I was just going to say that as part of SPAM, we did this project called Brilliant Vibrating Interface, which was a queer anthology, which existed online, a sort of digital sibling in a book. And during the launch of that was really interesting because we had this laptop, people could play around with some of the interactive pieces, and people didn't at first know what to do because other people were watching them kind of interact. And it's so strange, isn't it, when you're interacting with like the internet, it can feel quite a private thing. And yeah, that was really interesting to me too, because it was like, this is a kind of performance.
So I was going to say two things actually came to my mind when you were talking about this, because we're talking about emergent essaying as performance. Like, again, it takes me back to my engineering days where when we were in college, we had to perform the code in front of the invigilators. So you'd have to do the entire experiment, do the codes. And I was a communications engineer, right? So you have to make some satellite thing or whatever. So they'd come invigilators, they want to come see you do it in front of them. So you just hit like whatever, and then it has to happen in that moment in front of them. Otherwise you fail. So you have to perform it. So I would play with the glitches. Sometimes if the code wasn't fucking working on that day, I would play with the glitches to make the thing happen, even though the code wasn't working. So it's a performance. That's what matters. The other thing I had for you is you'd written in the essay in one of your papers about how, streaming platforms like Twitch these days, Twitch TV, where people play the games like, online, like it's live streamed or whatever. So now games are being made in a way for it to be played like that. So is that also sort of this sort of performative essaying, or like how do you describe that?
Yeah, I think this is so fascinating, right? And I'm really interested in that movement from like the user manuals we get to now, like it's more common to watch like a YouTube tutorial of someone playing the game. Like there's some great Sims ones where you can find like secret worlds, and I've only found that because of YouTube. And then we have Twitch, which was designed as a live streaming place for people to watch other people play games. I think it's so interesting, and increasingly Twitch is actually being used by lots of different kinds of artists. But I'm really intrigued by its kind of conception, or the fact that it originates within gameplay as this kind of performance. This is definitely something I want to start beginning to think more about. I haven't thought too much about this yet. I feel like this is just a strand of thinking that again has begun just as I'm able to take a little bit more of a step back from the project. But there have been conceptions where I wondered, like, what would it look like for me to play part of the game on Twitch?
Interesting,
people actually play with that stuff. Just because
play poetry on Twitch. I did when Twitch was all like popular and stuff. Like I wanted to see what it was about, so I went in to see if there's anything related to literature or poetry there. Like there were like 5 people watching it. So maybe gameplay related to poetry might be like might have more viewers. I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe like none, which is also really interesting, right? It's like if there's no one watching, like where does it still exist as a performance? But it is. Yeah, it's
that's
so
what the
interesting.
internet is all about. You're performing to
No one's watching my Instagram live. I'm still in this performance.
yeah.
You know? Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
love that. I mean, I used to love that about the internet, but now I feel like AI is watching everything.
I
So
know.
it's
So
like,
it's like we're
you know,
always being watched. Yeah, yeah.
it's sort of like you just go out into the void and say what you want and type what you want. But anyway, so another thing that I wanted to ask you about, which read somewhere in your work, was about variables. So,
Mm.
which is something we again use, in coding. You use, but you have to declare the variable to the program or the code itself. But in poetry, you don't declare the variable; you just keep it. So, you know.
Organic. Yeah.
So, I wanted to know how you think about that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in variables. I have seen variables used in digital poetry where different words can be stored and might be generated. Some great poets have done that include poets like Nick Montfort, J.R. Carpenter, I mentioned before. I suppose I'm really interested in variables both on a micro and a macro scale. So you know a lot about it, Sindhu, but for those who don't, like a variable could store value in a code. Like for example, in my piece, like there's a tracking of emotions. So like your adrenaline might be really high at one point or really low, for example. Um, and it can also store words, for example, and other values and things like that. So the piece that I'm working on that will be kind of the end of my doctoral research that will be published online, which is just called Emergent Essaying, is a collection of essays that can be read separately. So the one you read, Three Strings, is one of them, but when you play them together, they start to interact with each other, and they do that through variables. So I have an inventory of thinkers, so
Oh,
kind of
that's
like a
that's
traveling
interesting.
bibliography.
Wow.
So you pick thinkers up, and based on the thinkers you have, different conclusions will arise. So it's one reason why it's really hard to
Nice.
pin down what my piece is about, because that's the kind of whole point, if that makes sense. It's kind of an overly ambitious idea, but if it works, which hopefully it will, and that's one variable. Other variables include things like your emotions, and also certain words. So as I said, there's certain sections where the player can answer, um, you know, instead of putting players' names, answer questions, and those kind of come up. So those are also variables. And also based on where you've been. Let's say you've been in one of the more fictional parts of the collection, because there are stories and there are characters there as well. A character might follow you to another story, and they might not really be meant to
Oh,
be there. So things follow you, and I'm really
that's
interested in that.
very interesting. Oh my God.
Yeah, this is actually one of the most challenging parts of the piece to code, to be honest. It's caused me the most
Yeah.
nightmare, but it's the part I really want to work. And also there's micro variables, so things like um, if you click there is a passage at the beginning of one of my sections called glitchful thinking that has a certain word. I think rupture is one of them, and when you click on it, it goes to movement, and then it goes to glitch, and then it goes to, and if you click on one of those words, that will dictate kind of some of the theory that comes up. So those micro decisions, which is like an act of emergence, right? Like it might like seem like it's just sort of little kinetic wordplay, but they actually have repercussions for where the essay goes. So I love that the variables can be really small things that can maybe turn into bigger things, or they can stay small, or they can be huge. So I love that play with scale that the variables involve. Yeah.
That's super interesting because I feel like that would be the future of writing essays, right? Because people want to take their thought in different directions, and that's the only way you can do it, because you cannot in the way that we write right now, it's not easy to do that. So
Yeah.
you're onto something for sure. Here, I think. So,
So see you. Thank you.
thank you so much for talking to me, Kirsty. I think we're almost at the end of our 45-minute mark, but I think I think I managed to cover all the sort of questions I had for you, because the stuff that you do is so kinetic. It's like it is. It's everything. So it's very. But you seem to have a coherent way of putting all these, I don't know, connecting all the dots together. So ultimately, when you publish your doctoral research, it would be available online, like people could go and
Okay. it'll be publicly accessible. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Oh, wow, that's wonderful. So good luck with that. I
Thank
hope
you,
it
Cindy.
happens very soon.
And thank you for having me. And it's great to speak to someone that also understands the coding aspect too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know it's very rare to find somebody like you who does both, right? So this is interesting for me
I
too.
feel like this was great conversation.